The phone rang once, and silence followed. Welcome to Twilight Clue. I am your host, Langford. Tell me where you're listening from. Your comments uncover new clues each time. Your voices keep this mystery alive. Let's begin. It was the sort of evening when the city withdraws into itself. Oxford's stones, polished by centuries of drizzle and declamation, exhaled a damp fatigue. I had walked from the Randolph to the canal, the light surrendering itself in slow layers, and all the while the echo of a telephone call, unanswered, unfinished, threaded its way through the noise of my memory. There had been a ring, singular, precise, a sound that did not belong to the ordinary cacophony of life. It came at 6:47, as the church bell marked the hour. A coincidence, perhaps, but I have never trusted coincidence. I let it ring twice before lifting the receiver, by which time only silence remained. That particular shade of silence, too intimate to be accidental. Lewis had said earlier that the dead woman's watch stopped at 6:47. I had not mentioned the call, nor the way it seemed to leave a faint vibration on the air, like the last note of a symphony that no one applauds. The room I returned to that night was unremarkable, though I have always thought that loneliness reveals itself in furniture. A single armchair, too worn for comfort, books lying open, not because I read them, but because I could not bear to close them. On the desk, the case file, photographs of a girl whose face had learned too early to pretend. Her name was Claire, a postgraduate at St. Hilda's. Found in her rooms, the gas tap open, the windows sealed with careful deliberation. The police surgeon had written in that mechanical way of his, no signs of struggle. I remember tracing her handwriting from the notes recovered in her study. Elegant, slightly slanted, the sort of script that belonged to another century. There were drafts of a dissertation on medieval music, marginalia in Latin, and a crossword puzzle torn neatly in half. The clues were inked in two different hands. Lewis, bless him, thought it a trivial domestic clue, a lover's quarrel, perhaps. But there was something in the symmetry of the tear, a restraint that suggested ritual rather than rage. The clue that remained unsolved read, "Silent order hides a vow 6. I could not help thinking of the word monast. The fragment of a larger whole, monastery, monastic, each holding within it the promise of withdrawal. But 6 letters, cloist, choral, none fit. The answer hovered just beyond the reach of reason. Like the memory of a face one can describe but never name. I went to see her tutor the next morning, Dr. Fenwick, whose office smelled faintly of dust and old pipe tobacco. He spoke of Claire as one might speak of a ghost, with reverence and relief. She had been diligent, he said, though perhaps too devoted to her solitude. There had been a man, and there always is, a visiting lecturer in musicology. He had left for Vienna 2 weeks before her death. A note of regret lingered in his tone, though whether it was for Claire or for himself I could not tell. Fenwick mentioned, quite offhandedly, that Claire had been transcribing a series of Gregorian chants. One in particular had troubled her, Cantus Taciturnus, the Song of Silence. He smiled faintly as he said it, as if recalling a private joke. The melody, he explained, was unique for what it omitted. Pauses so prolonged that the listener became acutely aware of their own breathing. I remember thinking how cruelly appropriate that seemed. Back at the station, Lewis was waiting with a pot of tea that had long since gone cold. He had found something in the girl's correspondence, a letter from Vienna unsigned, written in the same hand that had filled half the crossword. The paper was watermarked with a small ring, a manufacturer's flaw perhaps, or something else entirely. Lewis said it looked like a halo. I said it looked like silence made visible. Later that evening, I sat again by the canal watching the reflections of college lights tremble upon the water. I found myself wondering about the phone call. If it had been Claire, or someone who wished to sound like her. The ring of silence, not merely an absence of sound, but a boundary between two kinds of knowing. It was then I noticed it, a pattern in the notes of her last transcription. Every 7th pause aligned perfectly with the letters of the missing crossword answer. 6 pauses, 6 letters. I wrote them out slowly, almost unwillingly. Carmen, the Latin for song, but not just any songs, a song of lamentation. I closed the file, though the case would not let me go. Oxford slept behind its gates and shadows, the rain beginning again with that familiar contemplative rhythm. I poured myself a whiskey and listened for the telephone, half hoping it might ring once more. It did not. Only the silence remained, the truest witness of all. It was raining that night, the sort of rain that does not fall but lingers, draping the city in a thin shroud of hesitation. I had taken the long way back from St. Giles, drawn perhaps by nothing more than the sound of water running down the gutters. Oxford after midnight is a cathedral of ghosts. The colleges hold their breath, the bells sleep, and only the river keeps time. At the corner near the old post office stood a call box, one of those red sentinels that once promised connection, but now offered only echoes. The door hung slightly ajar. Through the misted glass I saw her, a woman in a dark coat, hair unpinned, her head bent as if in prayer. She was speaking softly into the receiver, though no words reached me, only the gesture of speech itself, delicate and despairing. I might have walked on, most would have, but there was something about the way she held herself, too still, too composed for an ordinary night. I stepped closer, the rain whispering across the pavement, and as I did she turned her face towards me. Pale, almost luminous under the street lamp. Recognition stirred, uncertain and unwelcome. Claire's tutor had shown me a photograph that morning. The same profile, though younger, unshadowed. She saw me, and the line went dead. Her lips moved, perhaps forming an apology or perhaps something else entirely. I asked if she was all right. She said, without looking up, that she was trying to reach someone who wouldn't answer. Then she placed the receiver gently back on the hook, as if afraid of waking the past, and stepped into the rain. Lewis would later tell me I should have stopped her. Asked her name at least. But in truth there are moments when curiosity becomes cruelty. She walked toward Broad Street, her figure dissolving into the night, leaving only the faint impression of her footsteps. Light, deliberate, unhurried. I lingered by the call box. The glass door squeaked when I opened it, and inside the air smelled faintly of wet iron and tobacco. On the floor lay a page torn from a notebook, the edges damp and curling. Only 2 words remained legible. Forgive him. The rest was blurred, as though the rain itself had chosen to keep her confidence. I took the note, folded it carefully into my coat pocket. There was a number scribbled faintly at the top, 6 digits, no area code. An old Oxford exchange, from a time when voices travelled by wire rather than intention. Back at the station I asked Lewis to trace it. He yawned, muttered something about ghosts, but obliged. The line, it seemed, belonged to an unused office at the Bodleian, a department that hadn't existed for nearly 10 years. Music archives, according to the records, the same department where Claire had once volunteered. A coincidence, perhaps, or not. I returned the next afternoon, the rain now replaced by a sharp, unrepentant wind. The call box looked ordinary again, emptied of purpose. Yet as I stood there, a pattern began to form, subtle as a half-remembered melody. The woman's hand, her choice of words, the number she dialed, all fragments of something unfinished. At the Bodleian, the caretaker, an elderly man with eyes the colour of dust, led me through the lower stacks. The air was thick with the scent of vellum and resignation. He said the phone line had indeed been disconnected years ago, though occasionally late at night it would ring once or twice before falling silent. He had learned not to answer. Not to answer. As I left, I passed a notice board pinned with yellowing concert programs. One bore the title Cantus Taciturnus, the Song of Silence, the same composition Claire had been studying before her death. Beneath it, in faded ink, was the name of the conductor, Evelyn March, the woman at the call box. It was then I noticed something I had missed before. In the corner of the poster, a small circular stain, the ghost of a raindrop perhaps, or a ring left by a cup. But around it, faintly penciled, the same 6 digits as the number in my pocket. A message to herself, or to someone she could no longer reach. That evening, as the light faded over the spires, I poured myself a whiskey and listened again for the phone that would not ring. Somewhere in the city, a woman was still waiting for an answer. Somewhere silence was keeping its vow. I have often wondered if she ever spoke again, but Oxford is a place that thrives on unfinished sentences. And some calls, I think, are never meant to be returned. There are evenings when Oxford seems to exist in quotation marks, an elaborate parenthesis between one kind of silence and another. That night was such a one. The wind had been scouring the cloisters of St. Germain's all afternoon, and by dusk it had grown weary of its own persistence. The college lay half asleep, its courtyards glimmering faintly beneath the first suggestion of frost. Lewis had gone home. leaving me to my paperwork and the company of an unreliable radiator. But something in the day refused to be concluded. A name perhaps, or a glance misplaced. I found myself walking toward St. Germain's again, drawn less by duty than by the faint ache of unfinished thought. The porter, a man of uncertain years and certain discretion, looked surprised to see me. He said in that careful tone cultivated by Oxford porters that the fellows were at high table, except for Dr. Fenwick, who had retired early. I told him I would merely walk the quad. He nodded, though his eyes followed me as if memory itself might be contraband. The college had always felt slightly foreign to me, too symmetrical, too content with its own intellect. The scholars of St. Germain's, as they liked to call themselves, had built a small republic out of distinction and detachment. Even their chapel smelled of achievement. Through one of the windows I saw them, the scholars, dining beneath portraits of other scholars who had long ago perfected the art of being remembered. There was a certain choreography to it all, the measured gestures, the precise intervals between conversation and contemplation. I recognized Fenwick's empty chair at the far end. The wine beside it remained untouched, though the candle had burned halfway down. I waited until the dinner ended, and as the fellows dispersed into the long corridor, their robes brushing against the flagstones, I noticed one of them, a tall man with a hesitant gait, pause before Fenwick's door. He slipped an envelope beneath it and moved on without looking back. A simple act, perhaps. Yet something in its rhythm unsettled me. People in guilt seldom hurry. They move as though rehearsing innocence. The next morning I called on Fenwick. His room smelled faintly of linseed oil and lost arguments. He was seated by the fire, a blanket over his knees, his face the color of parchment. He said he'd been unwell. I said I'd seen someone leave him a message. He smiled, a weary, impeccable smile, and said there was no message worth troubling over. I noticed then that his bookshelf had been rearranged. A man's library is a confession written without ink, and this one had recently been edited. A row of monographs on early music had vanished, replaced by volumes of philosophy. I asked about them casually. He said they were on loan to a colleague, a scholar named March, Evelyn March, the woman at the call box. He caught my expression and added, too quickly, that she had left the college some years before, after what he called an unfortunate misunderstanding. He did not elaborate, and I did not insist. Some silences are best approached obliquely. Back in the quad, I lit a cigarette and watched the smoke mingle with the morning mist. Across the grass, a group of students were rehearsing a Latin hymn, their voices rising in fragile unison. I recognized the melody almost at once, Cantus Taciturnus, the same composition that bound Claire to March and March to Fenwick. The song that lingered even when it ceased. Lewis joined me later that afternoon, bringing with him his usual blend of practicality and mild exasperation. He had found something curious in the college archives, a ledger of stipends, noting payments to a visiting fellow in musicology. The name was partially erased, but the remaining letters left little doubt. The final payment had been made on the day Claire died. Lewis thought it coincidence. I thought it arithmetic. Deaths, like equations, rarely balance themselves. That evening I returned to Fenwick's rooms unannounced. He was not there. On his desk lay the same envelope I'd seen the night before, now opened. Inside, a single line written in Claire's hand. The pauses are the meaning. Beneath it, a fragment of musical notation. 6 rests perfectly spaced, each marked with a faint dot. I copied the pattern into my notebook and left. Outside, the air was brittle with the scent of frost. The chapel bell began to toll for Compline, each note dissolving into the next. As I walked past the cloisters, a thought arrived, hesitant, incomplete. The 6 rests were not silence but measure. 6 letters. The missing word in her final crossword, Carmen, the song. The same word I had found before. It was not revelation, merely a reminder that all things repeat themselves, like refrains half remembered. The scholars of St. Germain's would dine again tomorrow, their candles burning evenly, their talk erasing the memory of those who had sung before them. I walked on, listening to the echo of my own steps on the stone. In Oxford, even the silence is learned. I have never trusted the telephone. Too many confessions are lost to its circuitry, too many silences mistaken for mercy, voices reduced to their skeletons, stripped of breath, of warmth, of all that makes them human. And yet, it was through the telephone that the case began to speak again, weeks after we had folded it into the archives of unfinished grief. It was a Sunday, cold even for March, the city still half asleep. Louis had gone to see his sister, and I had stayed behind, half drowning in the quiet. The kettle sang to itself, the crossword waited on the armrest, and then the ring. 3 times, precise as punctuation. I lifted the receiver, expecting nothing, and heard, not words, but the faintest pattern of sound. 6 soft clicks, evenly spaced, followed by a hum that was almost a note. Then silence. Not the ordinary kind, but the deliberate silence of someone listening back. I said her name, Claire, without meaning to, and the line went dead. Louis, when I told him later, tried to hide his concern behind that bluff practicality of his. He said lines crossed sometimes, that there were still old cables beneath the Bodleian running nowhere. I said yes, perhaps. But I knew better. Oxford hides its ghosts in the wires. That evening I walked to St. Germain's. The porter nodded, though his eyes flickered with a question he didn't dare voice. Fenwick's rooms were dark. Across the quad, the chapel lights burned low, the choir practicing something without melody. Only breath. I waited outside until the sound died. On my way back through the cloisters, I noticed the telephone again, the one mounted on the wall near the old library. It hadn't worked for years, the cable cut flush against the stone. Yet its receiver hung slightly off the hook, swaying gently as if disturbed by a recent hand. I pressed it to my ear absurdly, knowing it was useless. But there it was again. 6 clicks, faint, like raindrops on glass. I traced the wire down the wall, through the cracks of time and renovation, until it disappeared behind a wooden panel. Someone had cared enough to leave it intact. The next morning I found Fenwick in the refectory, staring at a cup of tea he would not drink. He looked older, the kind of old that begins from the inside. I asked him when he had last spoken to Evelyn March. He said she had gone abroad, Vienna perhaps, though his voice betrayed a tremor of uncertainty. I told him she had been seen in Oxford 2 weeks earlier, near the canal. He nodded once as if acknowledging an overdue debt. Before I left, he said something I have not forgotten. There are some voices, he murmured, that don't belong to the living or the dead. They belong to memory, and memory never hangs up. Memory never hangs up. Later, I went through the file again. Claire's transcripts, her marginalia, the crossword. I looked once more at the phrase. The pauses are the meaning. What if the pauses weren't metaphor at all? I played back the recorded call on my office machine. 6 clicks. A pause, 6 again. Not random. A sequence. I fetched the score of Cantus Taciturnus from the evidence folder, the one she had annotated in pencil. 6 rests marked precisely, each corresponding to a letter. C-A-R-M-E-N. The same word that had followed me like a refrain. But after the 6th in her copy, she had added one more. A 7th rest, unmarked, uncounted. It changed the rhythm entirely. It introduced dissonance, the kind that refuses resolution. Louis knocked, interrupting whatever thought had begun to form. He said the Bodleian's old line had been reactivated briefly at 6:47 the previous night, the same hour Claire's watch had stopped. A technical fault, the report claimed. Nothing more. He asked if I believed in coincidence. I said sometimes, but not here, not in a city that speaks in riddles. That night I returned home and sat beside the telephone. I didn't expect it to ring, though part of me still listened for it. The hum of the line was like breath against glass, soft and persistent. I thought of Claire, of Evelyn, of Fenwick and his silences, and of the voices that travel endlessly through the wires, searching for the one listener who might still understand. When I finally set the receiver down, the sound lingered, a faint echo as though somewhere far down the line, Oxford itself had drawn in a breath and chosen once again not to speak. It was in the library at St. Germain's that the case began to breathe again, quietly, like a wound reopening beneath a bandage. The air was dense with that peculiar perfume of neglect, dust, vellum, and the faint sweetness of decay. I had gone there not out of duty, but of restlessness, that unquiet that comes when a pattern is near completion but not yet revealed. Louis had taken the morning off. I told him I needed solitude, though in truth I feared what I might find in it. The porter led me through the anteroom and left without ceremony. The door shut behind me with the finality of a verdict. The manuscript lay waiting on the central table, a thick folio bound in cracked brown leather, its spine indented by time. Fenwick had mentioned it almost absently when we last spoke. Claire had been copying something for the archives, he'd said. He had not looked at me when he said it. Few people ever do when they lie. It was titled Cantus Taciturnus, a study in silent intervals. Inside, Claire's handwriting danced between the staves, her annotations faint but precise. The margins were filled with small notations, single words, fragments of Latin, mathematical intervals. Between the final lines of the score, she had written something in English. The music ends before it finishes. I stared at that line for a long while. There are sentences that do not explain, but rather confess. The manuscript's final page bore a stain, small and circular, not unlike a ring left by a glass. A familiar image by now. I traced it absently, my fingertips catching the faint impression of ink beneath. The shape wasn't uniform. It was a mark made by something heavier, metallic perhaps. Her seal. I fetched my magnifying lens from the coat pocket. Around the edge of the mark were faint letters, almost illegible. SGM, Societas Germaine Musicae. The Music Society of St. Germain's, a private fellowship long defunct. I had heard of it once in passing, a circle of scholars who met to study silence in sacred music. The irony had not escaped them, I imagined. I turned the next leaf and found a letter, folded neatly and tucked between the pages. The handwriting was elegant but unsteady. Evelyn Marches. He believes the pauses will absolve him. But silence is not forgiveness. It is only delay, no signature, no date. Only a small notation at the bottom corner, a symbol resembling a treble clef drawn backward. It struck me then that I had seen the same mark before, in Claire's notebook beside her unfinished crossword. The clue had read, Reversed Clef Hyde's Confession 5. I had dismissed it once as meaningless. But now as I retraced the logic of her puzzles, the answer surfaced with quiet inevitability. Guilt, not revelation, recognition. The echo of a bell drifted through the windows, low and indistinct. Afternoon already? I closed the manuscript, though the weight of it remained. On my way out I passed the librarian, a thin man with spectacles that seemed to magnify his suspicion. He asked if I had found what I was looking for. I told him I wasn't sure I ever had. He smiled faintly and said, "That's the trouble with Oxford, sir. We catalogue what we should bury." Outside the rain had begun again, fine, ceaseless, almost invisible. I walked toward the river, the manuscript's memory still in my coat. The sky had the pallor of unwashed stone. Beneath the bridge I saw a figure standing alone, half-shadowed by the arches. Fenwick. His umbrella lay unopened at his side, as though he welcomed the rain. He said he'd heard from Vienna. Evelyn had died the week before. Heart failure, they said. A quiet death, though he doubted there was ever anything quiet about her. He asked, without looking at me, whether I believed in atonement. I told him belief had little to do with it. Only evidence. He nodded, though he didn't understand. Few do. Later that night I sat in my flat, the rain drumming gently against the window pane, the manuscript open once more beside the whiskey glass. I turned to Claire's final annotation, written in the margin with unusual firmness. Sound is only memory returning to itself. I thought of the call box, the 6 clicks, the unseen hand on the receiver. I thought of Evelyn's backward clef, of Fenwick's silences, of Oxford's quiet machinery of guilt and grace. Somewhere between them all a truth existed, not solvable but certain in its sorrow. I closed the manuscript, extinguished the lamp, and let the darkness rise. In the hush that followed, the city seemed to listen back as though waiting for a note that would never be played. It was then I understood. The music had never ended. It had only fallen silent long enough for us to hear ourselves. It was one of those evenings when Oxford seemed to polish itself for ceremony. The lamps along St. Aldate's had just been lit, their reflections trembling faintly in the wet cobblestones, and the air held that peculiar mingling of wood smoke and expectation. St. Germain's was hosting its annual Founders' Feast, a tradition older than the crime I had been chasing, though the distinction, I suspected, was one of form rather than substance. Lewis arrived at my flat with the car, wearing a tie that appeared to resent him. He said the invitation had been extended out of courtesy. I said it was more likely curiosity. The dons of St. Germain's never missed a chance to observe the living in the company of their ghosts. The hall was magnificent in that austere, self-assured way of old money and older guilt. Portraits of former masters watched from the panelled walls, their eyes glazed with centuries of benevolent hypocrisy. The candles on the tables burned low, the wax trembling like old men's hands. Somewhere a violin tuned itself into obedience. Fenwick was there, of course, at the high table, his composure restored to the point of parody. He greeted me with that same soft civility, a man who has learned to speak in ellipses. He asked whether I still listened to Wagner. I said sometimes, when I felt particularly optimistic. He smiled at that, though not with his eyes. Across the room I saw a place card marked E. March. For a moment, absurdly, I thought she might appear, as though death were merely a delay in correspondence. But the chair remained empty. The space around it seemed more observed than any of the occupied ones. Dinner proceeded with the precision of ritual. Latin grace, polished silver, the faint murmur of conversation layered like polyphony. The college choir performed a short motet, something Palestrina, I think, and I caught a phrase that stirred a memory. Silentium in corde, silence in the heart. I wondered if Claire had copied it once, bent over her desk with that fatal devotion to perfection. Midway through the second course, the master rose for his customary address, a tedious balance of Latin quotations and academic self-congratulation. I watched Fenwick instead. He had grown pale, his hands clasped beneath the table, his gaze fixed not on the speaker but on the silver goblet before him. Every few moments, his thumb traced a small groove along its stem, rhythmically, compulsively. When the applause came, he flinched. Afterward, over portent cigars in the senior common room. The talk turned to Evelyn March. One of the younger fellows mentioned her work on medieval notation, another her abrupt departure. The conversation hovered uneasily between reverence and gossip. I let them speak. People reveal their guilt not by what they say, but by what they allow others to say in their presence. Fenwick, for his part, said nothing. He only stared at the fire, the reflection of it trembling across his glasses. Lewis, ever literal, whispered that the man looked haunted. I told him some men are born that way. When I finally stepped outside, the rain had returned, soft and deliberate. The quad was empty except for a single figure standing beneath the archway. Fenwick again. He asked whether I believed in absolution. I said I believed in evidence. He nodded as if the answer had been precisely what he feared. He said the college archives would be closed tomorrow for restoration. A small lie, but practiced. I asked what he intended to remove before they were locked. He said nothing, though his eyes flickered toward the chapel. I left him there, watching the rain dissolve the candlelight. On my way out through the gate, I noticed something small glinting in the puddles. A metal seal, the same insignia I had traced in the manuscript, SGM. It must have fallen from his pocket. I turned it over in my hand. The surface was scratched, the Latin motto half erased, but still legible, Ex silentio lux. From silence, light. Back in my rooms, I poured a whiskey and set the seal beside the glass. Its weight seemed disproportionate to its size, as though it carried more than metal within it. I thought of Claire's phrase, "The music ends before it finishes," and of the way Fenwick's thumb had moved against the goblet. Counting something, perhaps, or remembering, I realized then that the feast had been no celebration. It was a requiem disguised as tradition. Oxford, I thought, does not bury its dead. It invites them to dinner. The rain intensified. The windows hummed faintly, and somewhere in the distance a telephone rang once, but only once, before falling back into silence. There are sounds one hears only after silence has trained the ear for them. That night, I began to understand the difference. The city lay still beneath a thin veil of rain, the air full of that pale shimmer between dusk and night, when everything seems to wait for permission to vanish. I had been in my rooms. The files of St. Germain's spread before me like the detritus of an unfinished confession. Lewis had gone home. I poured a whiskey, listened to the steady ticking of the clock, and thought again of the seal I had found by the chapel gate. Ex silentio lux, from silence, light, a motto both noble and deceitful, the sort Oxford prefers. The telephone on my desk remained obstinately mute. I almost preferred it that way. Yet around midnight I thought I heard, or imagined I heard, and something else. Not the ring itself, but the faint pulse of a voice carried through the line, unformed, like a prayer struggling toward articulation. It came again, a low hum that was neither speech nor music. 6 tones, then a pause. 6 again. I turned down the lamp and lifted the receiver, though I knew there would be no one waiting. Still, the pattern continued, soft as breath. Then, abruptly, silence. I stayed there for a while, the receiver warm against my ear, listening to nothing. And then, beneath that nothing, something small but precise. The scrape of a chair, the creak of floorboards, a distant echo of water against stone. Somewhere nearby. Somewhere within Oxford itself. The next morning I went to St. Germain's again. The porter, half asleep in his booth, greeted me with the weary tolerance reserved for the persistent. He said the line to the old music rooms had been giving trouble. Strange noises, he called them. I asked if anyone had reported hearing a voice. He shook his head, though his eyes darted toward the chapel. Inside, the air smelled of candle grease and damp hymnals. I stood where I had last seen Fenwick, the rain filtering faintly through the high windows. On the lectern lay a small recorder. Not electronic, but the simple wooden kind one associates with childhood lessons. Someone had left it there, its mouthpiece darkened by use. I lifted it, and a slip of paper fell out. It was a torn page from Cantus Taciturnus. Claire's handwriting unmistakable, a single phrase circled in pencil. Vox absens, sed audita. A voice absent, yet heard. I took the recorder with me to the station. Lewis, upon seeing it, asked whether I'd taken up a new hobby. I ignored him, and examined the mouthpiece under the desk lamp. Inside, caught in the narrow hollow, was something glinting faintly. A thin sliver of wire, barely visible. Too fine to be accidental, a bug perhaps, or perhaps not. That evening I returned once more to the college, this time unannounced. The chapel door was unlocked. Candlelight wavered faintly in the choir stalls, though no one was there. Or rather, almost no one. A figure stood at the front, back turned to me. Fenwick. He did not start when I approached. He said without turning that she used to sing here after evensong. Claire. He said her voice could make silence seem like an accomplice. I asked if he had heard her recently. He gave a small laugh, the kind that precedes despair. He said every night. There are times when pity and suspicion occupy the same breath. I asked him whether Evelyn March had left anything behind. Letters, perhaps, or recordings. He said she had left only the unfinished manuscript, and that he had sealed it in the archives. When I told him the archives were locked, he looked at me as though seeing someone long dead. He asked almost gently whether I believed sound could linger after the voice that made it had gone. I said I believed in echoes, nothing more. He said, "Then you already believe enough." The candles flickered. Somewhere unseen, a drip of water struck stone in perfect measure. When I turned to leave, I caught sight of a small object resting on the pew beside him, another recorder, identical to the one I carried. Its surface was damp as if recently played. Back in my flat, I placed the two side by side, one silent, one still faintly warm. I poured another whiskey and considered the pattern that had haunted the telephone line. 6 tones, pause, 6 again. A rhythm of absence. When I pressed my ear to the mouthpiece of the recorder, I thought I heard, just once, the ghost of a note, the suggestion of a woman's breath, the faintest trace of what might have been song. I do not know whether it was real. Perhaps it was only my own longing that made it audible. But I have learned that Oxford keeps its voices not in memory but in matter, in stone, in wire, in air, and when I finally switched off the lamp, the darkness itself seemed to hum, low, persistent, unfinished. A voice without words waiting to be heard. There are evenings when Oxford resembles an old recording played at the wrong speed, familiar, yet subtly warped. That night was one of them. The city's sounds came to me as if from underwater. A bicycle bell somewhere near Magdalen Bridge. The faint laughter of students too young to understand what time does to such laughter. And beneath it all the slow pulse of rain, steady and unresolved. Lewis had suggested dinner at the Trout, an attempt to distract me, perhaps, from the case that refused to be closed. I declined. The thought of company at even his felt like an intrusion upon the silence I'd come to depend on. Instead, I found myself walking towards St. Germain's once more, drawn less by purpose than by that private gravity of unfinished things. The college was half asleep. Lamps burned low along the cloisters, their halos dissolving in mist. Somewhere faintly the sound of a piano, hesitant notes, searching for each other, missing by fractions, false harmonies. The sound came from the old music rooms, the same wing that housed the disconnected telephone, the same walls that had carried voices when there should have been none. I paused at the doorway. Fenwick sat at the piano, his back to me, the keys beneath his hands uncertain. He was playing something that might once have been adagio in G minor, but it faltered after every phrase, as though the melody refused to return his affection. He did not turn when I entered. He said quietly that Claire had loved this piece, though she never played it the same way twice. I asked if that was why he played it now. He said perhaps, or perhaps he only wanted to know where the music broke. He spoke then of Evelyn March, how she had written her treatise on silence not as an academic study, but as an act of contrition. He said she believed that every dissonance, every pause, contained a truth unfit for harmony. I asked if he believed it too. He said he used to. The rain thickened against the windows, blurring the lights of the quad. On the piano lid lay a stack of papers, music sheets covered in March's elegant looping hand. Across the top was written, Cantus Taciturnus, Revised Edition, but the annotations were not hers. I recognized Fenwick's handwriting, the same angular script from the ledger Lewis had found. He had been rewriting her work line by line. I asked what he hoped to correct. He said he wasn't correcting. He was finishing. That she had left him no choice. A silence settled between us, neither comfortable nor entirely hostile. Then, almost absently, he reached into his jacket and withdrew a small cassette tape. He placed it on the piano beside the manuscript. He said it was Claire's final recording. Her voice, he added, not her music. She had phoned him the night she died, left a message on his answering machine. 6 pauses, then her voice. I asked if he had listened to it. He said once, only once. Then he looked at me and asked whether guilt could be harmonic, whether one could live long enough for wrong notes to resolve themselves. I told him I doubted it. He pressed a key, a single F minor that lingered like a bruise, and said that perhaps silence was the only resolution left. Then he rose, placed the cassette in my hand, and left without looking back. Back in my flat, I sat at the desk, the tape beside the whiskey glass. The label was smudged, as though handled too often. I poured a drink, set the recorder beside me, and pressed play. At first, nothing. Then the faint click of the line, followed by 6 seconds of static or pauses. Then her voice. Soft, almost apologetic. She said she had discovered something she wasn't meant to. That the music, the manuscripts, the research, it was all a conversation between 2 silences, neither of which belonged to God. And then, as if catching herself, she whispered a single word I could barely make out. Forgive. The tape ended with a low hum, indistinguishable from the sound of my own breath. I rewound it, played it again, listening for what I had missed. On the 3rd playback, I noticed something faint beneath her voice. The same piano Fenwick had been playing, the same hesitant chordal pattern. It wasn't a coincidence. She had recorded it from the chapel. He had been there. Lewis arrived the next morning full of his usual briskness, talking of reports and closures. I said nothing. The tape remained in my coat pocket, heavier than it should have been. We walked across the quad together, the morning light weak and colourless. The chapel bell began its slow toll, each strike slightly off pitch, like an instrument struggling to remember the key. Lewis asked if I thought Fenwick would resign. I said perhaps. Or perhaps he already had. As we left, I glanced back once. The piano's window was open, the curtain stirring in the cold wind. Somewhere within, the faint echo of an unresolved chord, that imperfect harmony which ends not with sound, but with the decision to stop listening. Oxford has never been a city of answers. It is a city of echoes, and some echoes once heard refuse to die. It was late, too late perhaps for any discovery worth making. The kind of hour when memory feels heavier than evidence. I had returned home from the station with the cassette still in my coat pocket, though I had promised myself not to listen again. Promises, I have found, are a form of wishful thinking disguised as discipline. The tape sat on the table beside the whiskey glass, half lit by the lamplight. Outside, the city had dissolved into its nocturnal hush, the slow drip from the eaves, a solitary car on St. Giles, the faint creak of my own floorboards as if the building were listening. I turned the tape over in my hands. The label, once white, had yellowed with touch and time. Across its surface, Claire's handwriting, Cantus Taciturnus Field Recording 3. A field recording of what? Silence? Confession? I wasn't sure anymore which she had been documenting. Lewis had told me to leave it alone. He'd said we'd learned all we could, that the case, though neither of us used the word, was closed. I'd agreed. Then I'd gone home and poured myself another whiskey. It was near midnight when I slid the tape into the player. The machine clicked softly, like a heartbeat starting up again after a long rest. At first there was only static, the kind of sound that feels less like noise than breathing. Then faintly a sequence of tones, 6 in all, perfectly spaced. The same pattern I'd heard before, but clearer this time, deliberate. After that, silence, and then her voice, Claire's, uncertain, almost embarrassed by its own existence. She spoke slowly, as if each word cost her something to release. She said she had found something within the music, a pattern hidden between the pauses, a second rhythm that mirrored the first, but ran backward. She said Fenwick would never understand, that he believed silence was purity, when in truth it was only concealment. She paused then, and I thought I heard her inhale. The sound was unsteady, too long, too final. She began again, this time softer. She said she had gone to the chapel that night, that she had played the cantus one last time, that the air had changed with each rest. She said she could feel someone else there, listening. Not Fenwick. Someone older, someone she did not name. The tape cracked then, the sound fracturing into a blur of interference. I adjusted the volume, but the distortion only deepened. Beneath it, faintly, there was music, or something that pretended to be. A piano halting, hesitant, a melody collapsing under its own weight, and then suddenly another voice, male. It wasn't clear, but it wasn't unfamiliar. The words indistinct, though one sentence emerged, it's already written. Then the sound of the receiver being placed down, gentle, final. The same sound I'd heard on my own line weeks ago. I stopped the tape. The room seemed smaller, as though the air had thickened. I poured another drink, though my hands were less steady now. When I played the tape again from the start, the sequence repeated. 6 tones, the pauses, the voice. But this time I noticed something new. Between the static, almost imperceptibly, there was a faint echo of my own voice. Not words, but cadence, a rhythm I recognized. I'd spoken those same words once, in that same tone, in Fenwick's office, when I'd said perhaps silence is the only resolution left. I don't believe in hauntings, not in the way poets do. Yet there are times when the boundaries of sound and memory blur, when the living and the lost speak in the same language. The rain began again, slow at first, then insistent. I switched off the tape. The silence that followed felt somehow rehearsed, like a closing movement. The next morning I took the tape to the university archives. The librarian, a small woman with a manner of deliberate forgetfulness, examined it briefly before setting it aside. She said they kept hundreds like it, field notes from musicologists' lectures, fragments of untraceable voices. She asked whether I wished to label it under evidence or observation. I said neither. She nodded, understanding too much, and placed it among the unlabeled recordings. Lewis called later to ask if I'd slept. I told him yes. He said they'd found Fenwick's car abandoned by the river. No note, no sign of struggle, only a book left on the passenger seat, a copy of Evelyn March's Silence and Form. The last page marked, the final line underlined twice. Every pause must end in sound. Even if no one remains to hear it, I didn't answer him. There are silences one must earn, silences one. That evening, as the light faded over the city, I passed the Bodleian steps and heard faintly the echo of a piano from one of the upper rooms. 6 notes, then nothing. Perhaps the tape had never belonged to Claire at all. Perhaps it belonged to Oxford itself, the great archivist of unfinished voices. I walked on, and the sound or memory of it followed. Quiet, insistent, unresolved. It is a strange thing, silence. You spend your life pursuing it, the quiet room after questioning, the last page of a confession, and yet when it finally arrives, you find it says more than any voice ever could. I remember that morning with a kind of dull clarity. The river had thawed overnight, leaving the air raw with the smell of wet stone. Lewis drove in silence, hands clenched on the wheel. The car radio turned low but not off, as if afraid to offend the day. They'd found him, Fenwick, in the reeds below Folly Bridge. Not drowned exactly. The body had rested half on the bank, as though he had simply lain down beside the river to listen. The doctor said it was peaceful. They always say that. I have never believed them. Lewis talked of procedures, of reports and chains of evidence. I half listened. My mind was elsewhere. On the tape, on Claire's voice, on the music that seemed to exist only in the spaces between things. The river reminded me of that music, calm on its surface but with something moving beneath. When we reached the scene, the constables were already packing away their duty. Fenwick's car stood a few yards off, door ajar, the faint smell of petrol and rain lingering like a half-remembered scent. On the dashboard, a book, the same copy of Silence and Form Lewis had mentioned, now swollen with water. The underlined sentence blurred almost beyond reading, but I could make out the word sound through the smear of ink. A recorder lay beside it. The wooden kind again, its mouthpiece clogged with silt. I lifted it carefully. Inside, faint traces of something white, wax perhaps, or ash. Lewis asked if I thought it mattered. I told him everything matters, though not necessarily for the reasons we wish. Later, back at the station, I set the recorder beside the old cassette player. They looked absurd together, one belonging to a child's music lesson, the other to a forgotten interrogation room. I pressed play, though I knew what waited was absence, but there was something faint, almost imperceptible. A sound like the exhale of wind through a narrow pipe. 6 tones. Always 6. Then the rhythm stopped, and the machine clicked off, exhausted. Lewis returned with the post-mortem notes. He said the cause was as expected. Sleeping pills, whiskey, resignation. He asked if I was all right. I told him I preferred questions without answers. He said that wasn't healthy. I said neither was Oxford. After he left, I turned once more to the crossword Claire had begun. I had kept it all this time without reason, though reason rarely governs the things we hold on to. Only one clue remained unfinished. Echo's End, 4. I thought of all the sounds that had ended in silence. The ringing phone, the music, the voices folded into static. The answer, when it came, felt too simple to be true. Fade. Perhaps she had meant it as prophecy. Perhaps only as closure. That evening I walked to the chapel. The college had locked it, of course, but Oxford's locks are never secure against persistence. The room smelled of wax and damp stone, that old companionship of faith and neglect. I sat in the front pew. Outside, the rain began again, thin and determined. The piano was still there, its lid half open, keys yellowed with disuse. I played the 6 notes I had memorized, clumsy but precise. Their echo lingered for a moment, before retreating upward into the vault. For an instant it seemed as though the air were answering, not with sound, but with something beyond it, the suggestion of listening. I remembered Fenwick's words then, the way he'd asked whether guilt could be harmonic. I think he believed in the end that it could, that each dissonance we leave unresolved must eventually find its rest somewhere beyond hearing. I poured myself a whiskey when I returned home. The kind of whiskey that makes memory feel almost manageable. The recorder sat beside me on the desk. I turned it once in my hand, then set it down. The air hummed faintly, or perhaps it was only the house settling, or perhaps, and I cannot quite dismiss the thought, perhaps it was the river finding its voice again. I switched off the lamp. In the dark, the silence pressed close, not cruelly, but with the intimacy of something long familiar. The city slept beyond the glass. Somewhere a clock struck, the tone slightly off, as though even time itself had grown uncertain of its pitch. It occurred to me then that all sound ends not in silence, but in memory, and memory, for all its noise, is never more than an echo trying to fade. That was the last night I listened to the tape. Or perhaps it was the first time I truly heard it,